At 9:42 in the morning on October 5, 2019, in Frankfort, Kentucky, a state archivist unsealed a brittle envelope stamped "Farm Accident," and a pinch of black soot fell like pepper onto the catalog table. The packet contained a charred plantation ledger, a bent brass key fused to iron scale, and a county report that measured losses in tidy columns while omitting names. The soot contradicted the report's dry conclusion of misadventure. It smelled faintly of animal fat and lamp oil, a mix consistent with deliberate kindling rather than a barn spark. 3 witness statements were missing from the file, replaced by slips marked "removed to special collection." A penciled note at the bottom margin read, in a later hand, not barn fire, counting house. A map fragment pinned to the envelope's corner showed a bend in the Ohio River and a dotted line crossing to the northern bank. In the soot was the outline of a fig leaf impressed into the paper. Revenge leaves its own geometry. Before we dig in, a quick note. If this kind of exclusive investigation holds your attention, consider subscribing. The plantation that Ledger once governed stood at a crooked elbow of the Ohio, within sight of the northern shore, where Ohio law refused slavery. Locals called the place Rook's Bend for the blackbirds that nested in the river sycamores, and for the chessboard pattern the tobacco fields cut into the bottomland. The main house sat on a low rise of clay, whitewashed and rectangular, with a brick counting house set apart behind a hedgerow of boxwood. To its east stretched pens, sheds, a smokehouse, and a smithy. To its west, the slave quarters faced a trampled yard where the bell hung from a horizontal beam, blackened by the smoke of many seasons. Guard routines followed the river's moods. Mounted patrols at dusk when fog pooled in the hollows, lantern checks at midnight during harvest weeks, kennel dogs kept lean to ensure attention. The book in the envelope, its spine salted with ash, once recorded wages not paid, hogsheads tallied, bales swapped for credit, and purchases of chain and paper and rope. Its pages also tracked fines for imagined disobedience and the price of human labor down to the half-day. The bent brass key, fused to scale, matched the counting house's strongbox lock by shape and wear. The county file listed a loss of approximately $12,000 in banknotes and coin, a sum that modern valuation places near $472,345. The report called the blaze an unfortunate conflagration. The ledger's margins, blistered but legible where ash did not eat the ink, told a different story. A sequence of corrections over several weeks, an unusual withdrawal of small bills, and a final day's figures entered in a neater hand than the clerk's usual scrawl, a hand that looped its F's like nails drawn from a forge. The man who learned to write those loops was known on the Hoham place as Josiah Fields. He grew up in the hemp rows and tobacco sheds of Rook's Bend and knew the property by its smells and textures. The ammoniac bite of curing leaf, the iron tang of the forge, the dusty sweetness of milled corn. In the smithy he could square a nail and true a hinge. In the yard he could read the weather from the sheen on a horse's coat. When the master's son broke a lock by forcing it with a flathead driver, the overseer brought the piece to Josiah to mend, and he studied the lock's geometry, ward, tumbler, throat, until he could imagine the shape of a key from the way steel met steel. The counting clerk once sent him to fetch a fresh ledger and, irritated by delay, left him standing in the doorway as columns aligned under the nib. Josiah's eyes followed the clerk's hand, catching the pattern of sums, the habit of adding twice, the careless carry that shorted a credit. Numbers became like fence rails. Count them, and you know where the gate is. His private ritual, formed in the scant quiet of early dark, was simple. After the bell's last toll, he rubbed the lamp black into the cracks of his fingers so no splinter of wood or bit of iron could betray a shine. He wrapped his wrists with rag strips to muffle the brush of skin on wood. He held in his mind a map of distances, yard to shed, shed to hedge, hedge to counting house, paced out by heartbeats rather than steps, so that any change in rhythm, any new guard or dog path announced itself. He kept a fig seed, taken from the only fig tree on the property beside the counting house wall, in his cheek to remind himself there was sweetness in the world beyond work. The wound that grew into motive began with family disassembled by ledger lines. The master, Major Silas Calder, prided himself on order and profit. He permitted pairings when they promised more labor, but sold those same bonds when cash ran thin. Josiah's firstborn son was carried downriver as part of such arithmetic, invoiced with hemp bales to cover a banknote. His partner, Dinah, was reassigned to the big house laundry, where Lye burned her hands and the cook's ladle left welts when the rhythm slowed. For complaining, so the ledger noted, she lost rations for a week. That same week, a new entry appeared: purchase of 2 lengths of chain, replacement of strongbox hasp, payment to county patrol for extra rides. The antagonists who held power at Rook's Bend arranged themselves by function and appetite. Silas Calder, the owner, loved the sound of keys, the tap of them against his palm as he walked the veranda. His vice was debt disguised as daring. He wagered on crop yields and river levels, and flattered himself that fortune respected nerve. He surrendered practical authority to his overseer while keeping the instruments of fear, the auction contract, the patrol subscription, under his own seal. Matthew Pike, the overseer, rode a roan mare with a rawhide quirt looped to the saddle. He believed in spectacle. Punishments happened in the yard under the bell where their sound could work on the rest like weather beating a roof. His method of control was sunrise inspection and surprise lash. His weakness was liquor flavored with molasses kept in a tin behind the tool shed. After a few pulls, he sang old soldier songs and missed details. Edgar Bell, the counting clerk, lived in a narrow room above the counting house with a ticking Dutch clock and a view of the hedge. His hands shook when he drank, so he drank at night and balanced the books by day with a calculus of petty theft, shaving tobacco weights to clear his own gambling debts at the River Tavern. He wore his penknife on a ribbon around his neck, a habit picked up from a previous posting where a knife meant status. His weakness was precision turned inward. When figures did not match, he corrected in a second ink, leaving a trail. Ambrose Keene, captain of the county patrol on the Kentucky side, walked with a limp earned in a boggy chase and made up for the inconvenience with dogs and hired zeal. He liked fees paid in coin and spoke of duty while counting the number of collars in his wagon. He slept afternoons under a sycamore near the ferry landing, a hat over his face, trusting the dogs more than his men. Seated across this arrangement were objects and places that would later matter. The fig tree abutting the counting house wall cast a cool oval on summer afternoons and lifted its roots into the mortar so that a determined hand could find purchase. A decoy keyring hung from a nail inside the smithy, stamped with dents Josiah made by pressing blank iron into actual locks. From a distance it looked official. Up close it was soft and uncut. A rusting padlock secured the smokehouse door, its shackle eaten enough that a wedge and twist would pop it. A flaw Pike never saw, because he only yanked once and moved on. A bell rope, tarred and frayed, hung from the yard beam where the iron tongue could ring false if the rope were knotted just so. And the ledger itself, kept on a dedicated table in the counting house, flanked by a sand shaker and sealing wax, bore a small burn on page corners from a past candle drip, a reminder of how paper takes flame. Weather pressed its own logic on the place. Autumn winds moved upriver in long breaths that carried cinders far if stoked and aimed, while morning fog softened distances and muffled the clink of hardware. Dry weeks turned the tobacco sheds into tinder boxes. Wet weeks filled the yard with slick clay that printed footprints like signatures. In a dry spell, soot would travel. In a damp one, it would fall in clumps that told a fire's origin by the size of the flakes. Routine served as both surveillance and blind spot. At first light, the bell tolled, and bodies arranged into crews. Field hands to rows, smith to forge, laundry to kettles, cook to ovens, children to gather kindling. Pike rode a slow circle past quarters and sheds, checking faces, more than tools, then cut across to the main house where Calder took his coffee and watched from the veranda. Bell opened the counting house in mid-morning, set the ledger on its table, measured coin into the strongbox by weight more than count, and kept the spare key in a small tin set inside a hollowed almanac. At noon, the bell sounded again, and the yard filled with steam and smell from kettles. After noon, the patrol might appear, dogs testing the wind, men testing the will of those who moved between buildings. By evening, smoke, sweat, and lie made a haze under the sycamore crowns, and when the bell closed the day, the place tried to imitate peace with small sounds. Spoons and tins, soft footfalls, the faint ring of a farrier's last blows. In that feigned quiet, Josiah practiced his small arts. He made blanks that felt in the palm like potential and held them against warm locks to taste the alignment through the metal. He studied Bell's hand as it returned the almanac to its shelf and measured the distance between ledger table and strongbox with his eyes, converting boards to heartbeats. He mapped the bell rope's swing, and the moment it briefly slackened at the seam between the yard beam and the post. He measured Pike's drinking by the hour he went soft, and Keene's patrol by the time dogs lifted their noses at river scents rather than yard ones. News traveled as rumor, with details coded into gesture. Field hands marked days on hoe handles with discreet cuts. Laundry women counted loops of linen as if to measure time. A ferryman on the northern bank, in a town that obeyed different law, ran a lantern up and down twice on clear nights when the southern shore lay quiet. A child on the Calder property, sent to pick up dropped nails, repeated a fragment about a hollow book without knowing its weight. The ticking signal that would align all these parts came not from a holiday but from a scheduled audit after harvest, when Bell would be required to present the ledger to Calder in the dining room and show line by line how the season balanced. That evening, lamps would burn late, the counting house would be emptied of its papers to the main house for review, and the strongbox would be loaded with coin and notes for delivery to a river agent the next morning. The audit date lay fixed by the tobacco auction in town. The dogs would be penned to keep them from wandering among guests, and Pike would drink earlier than usual, entertaining rivermen who liked to test the overseer's boasts. The bell would ring after the meeting ended, one long pull to mark the finish. Then silence would stack like cordwood while the house slept, and the field hands listened for any change in wind. By the time that envelope was opened in Frankfurt 2 centuries later, the geometry of revenge was already set. The ledger's blistered margins, the bent key, the fig leaf's ghost pressed into soot, their arrangement pointed back across the river and across years to a night when routine became cover, paper became kindling, and a man trained by iron, numbers, and absence shaped a plan to leave. The audit loomed like a metronome. The bell rope waited with its hidden knot. The hedge hid a narrow gap where a body might pass without brushing leaves, and the river, wide in daylight and wider in fear, promised a line that could be crossed in a breath if wind and smoke and timing agreed. The audit supper ended under lamplight, and the bell gave its long, single pull that meant books balanced and guests were turning toward brandy. That sound was Josiah's first marker. He had spent the afternoon in plain view at the forge, striking iron until his ears rang to mask the counting in his head. When darkness settled, he rubbed lamp black into his knuckles, tied rag strips at his wrists, and moved into the practiced rhythm of a map walked by heartbeat. Wind breathed upriver, steady and dry. Fog held to the low river but spared the yard. The night offered the exact physics he needed: air that would pull flame across paper, and a silence that would amplify any mistake. He began in the quarters, not from sentiment but logistics. The first set piece belonged to the bell. The tarred rope had a hidden knot he had rehearsed for weeks, a small hitch high at the beam that, when tugged and released, caused a thin, uncanny half-ring that sounded like a summons cut short. He needed that sound to pull eyes toward the yard at a moment of his choosing. 2 elders and a nimble child knew only their small parts. When the half-ring came, the elders would quarrel over a water bucket to create a clatter. The child would fetch pike with frantic gestures and point toward the smokehouse. Their roles were not courage, but cover. Josiah reached the beam in shadow, tested the knot with his fingertips, and felt the slight slack that meant the hitch would hold until jerked free. Objective set. A false alarm stored in the rope, waiting to be triggered. Consequence planned. Pike would move to spectacle, not to silence. Next, he crossed the yard at a diagonal that avoided kennel scent lines. In the smokehouse, he worked by texture. Tallow cakes wrapped in torn linen lay under a bench, saved from candle making. He shaved them with a paring blade, warmed the fat in a small iron ladle on a shard of coal, and thinned it with lamp oil skimmed from the cook's jug. The mixture clung to straw like honey. He packed sleeves of it into cheesecloth and braided 3 short fuses that burned slow but certain. He did not intend an explosion. He wanted a paper fire that ate ledgers and left iron to tell a different lie. He primed a path from the fig tree's exposed roots along the counting house sill, where mortar had cracked, and ended it at the ledger table's leg. He laid 1 fuse under the table edge, 1 near the strongbox stand, and kept the 3rd in his pocket for contingency. This was the second set piece, an accelerant that remembered animal and lamp, designed to print itself later in soot and smell. Consequence engineered. A burn pattern that began at the table, not the stove. He passed the hedge through the narrow gap and crouched by the counting house door. He knew the lock by its temper. The spare key did not hang in plain sight. Bell kept it inside a hollowed almanac, set spine out on a low shelf. Josiah slipped in, kept to the wall, and paused until his breath matched the clock's ticks. The Dutch clock marked the room with slow, wooden certainty. He found the almanac by weight, slid out the tin, and let the spare key settle into his palm. The strongbox sat beneath the table like a square animal at rest. He did not rush the warded lock. He warmed the key in his hand, felt the tiny chatter of the throat, and turned only when the tongue could lift clean. The lid gave the soft sigh he had taught himself to hear. Inside lay coin sacks and banknotes in banded bundles, small bills layered for market change, larger notes folded for the river agent. He removed the small bills first, fanning bundles into a cloth sling he had stitched into the lining of his shirt. Then he took a measured portion of the larger notes, never emptying a stack, never leaving an obvious vacancy. He replaced weight with the wrapped nails prepared in the smithy, their heft similar in the hand to coin. He closed the lid until the latch almost caught, then lifted it a breath and closed again so the next hand to open would not feel ajar. This was the 3rd set piece: entry, withdrawal, and substitution. Consequence immediate, minutes purchased before alarm. On the ledger table lay the day's book, its pages open, the sandshaker tipped from use. Bell had transferred many papers to the main house for Calder's review, But not all. The daily ledger remained open to the last page, where a neat second hand had rewritten sums. Josiah read the columns once, not to admire the loops, but to fix in his mind the date and the faint smear where a fingertip had pressed the sand too early. He slid the ledger a finger's breadth closer to the table edge to make the fuses work certain. He palmed a small survey map from beneath the ledger, a torn fragment that showed the river bend and the dotted crossing to the northern bank, and folded it once, twice, until it vanished into the rag at his wrist. He touched the bent penknife on its ribbon where it hung over the chair back, registered its absence in his plan, and left it alone. The fourth set piece nested inside the third, seed a clue, and nudged the paper toward flame. Consequence later, an archivist would smell fat and oil and find a ledger that told more than the report. His route now bent toward the main house only long enough to fix the night's traffic. He crept under the dining room window to hear chairs scrape, the shuffle of accounts concluding, the cadence of men settling into self-congratulation. A servant carried the ledger copies back to the clerk's room. He saw the flicker of lamplight above the counting house as Bell climbed the narrow stair. That saved him a risk. He would not have to cross the threshold of the big house. He took his place by the fig tree, lifted the fuse, and breathed the air, testing the wind's draw along the wall. The leaves shifted without rustle. The mixture would pull inward, not outward. Ideal. The countermove came raw and early. Ambrose Keene, who should have been asleep under the sycamore by the ferry, arrived with 2 men and a young dog, drawn by rumors of coin after an audit and by his own suspicion of nights that smelled like opportunity. The kennel dogs were penned for guests, but Keene's pup was not. It lifted its nose and traced a thin ribbon of tallow on the night, turning its head toward the hedge and the counting-house door with the curiosity of a creature new to its duty. Josiah saw the lamp bob on Keene's staff, saw Pike loosen his quirt and rise from his seat on the veranda, and felt the night close a notch. The flaw that almost ruined the plan was neither iron nor fire. It was a nose. He adapted by time, not by strength. He jerked the bell rope once, hard, and released. The half-ring peeled across the yard, a cut sound that suggested interruption rather than command. The elders spilled their bucket as rehearsed. The child ran in a zigzag, arms pumping, pointing toward the smokehouse. Pike turned at sound and motion, irritation flaring into instinct. He moved toward spectacle as predicted, and Keene, jealous of yard authority, followed with a mutter and a click of his tongue. The pup veered with him, then paused, confused by the stronger scent of molasses-flavored liquor Pike had spilled on his own boots. Josiah slid along the counting-house wall like shade. He opened the door a hand's breadth, braced the fuse under the ledger table leg, and struck a spark in the shelter of his body with the flint he carried for shoeing nails. The cheesecloth took fire with a soft flower of blue before turning amber. He breathed on it once, feeding it enough to travel under the table. He closed the door to a finger's gap so the draft would pull in, not out. Chaos multiplied as designed and undesigned forces interwove. Pike reached the smokehouse and found nothing but the sweet, faint scent of fat. He swore under his breath and struck the door with his palm, which loosened the rusted padlock's compromised bite. The door swung and tapped against the frame, an accidental metronome. Keene's men laughed, then hushed as the bell rope, free now of its knot, swayed and gave a full ring that was no longer false. Bell, above the counting house, startled at the sound and rose too quickly. His chair scraped and tipped, and his penknife on its ribbon tapped the floorboards, a small, sharp chime. The pup, hearing a blend of new notes, tugged toward the hedge again. Inside the counting house, the fuses had begun their work. Tallow-rich flame crawled along the sill, kissed the table leg, and found the page edges. Paper darkened, then curled. The sand on the ledger pitted and popped as trapped grains heated. The heat licked upward toward the strongbox stand, not with the rage of a stove flare, but with the purposeful hunger of a controlled burn. Josiah waited through 3 breaths, then slid to the fig tree and pressed his shoulder to the trunk. He pulled away lower leaves so their silhouette would not shield the open sill. He wanted the wind to draw the heat inward and keep sparks from jumping into the yard. He wet his rag with spit and wiped his wrists to dull any tallow sheen that might catch a stray light. The pup found the tallow line at last and yipped softly. Keen swung his lamp toward the hedge just as a new sound cut the night. A thin crackle, then a low roar as the paper fire inside found enough oxygen to blossom. Light touched Bell's window from below. He shouted, a sound reported later by others as a single barked curse, and stumbled down the stair. Josiah moved then, not away but sideways, using the glare as cover. He slipped behind the hedge toward the gap, pressed through, and drew his body along the back of the smithy until the yard noise spread like heat. Pike wheeled at the glow. Keen veered in pride toward the counting-house door, and the pup, startled by flame, backed and tangled its lead around Keen's legs. Men became their own obstacles. Consequence now moved faster than intention. The counting house breathed fire in and out like a smith's furnace under a hard pump. The ledger table blackened along its edge and collapsed toward the stand. A coil of smoke took the shape of the room, pressed at the ceiling, and smudged the brass of the clock's pendulum until it slowed to a halt. The strongbox, heated unevenly, sang a low, warping note as brass met heat. The smell carried what later archivists would identify without guessing: rendered fat and lamp oil layered on oak and rag. The fig leaves nearest the sill curled and scorched, but did not leap to flame. Their moisture saved them. The imprint of one leaf fell in ash onto the table and lifted again in the draft. A paper ghost waiting for a future envelope. Josiah did not watch the house consume itself. He ran the long shadow from smithy to river path, but not as a sprint. He chose a pace that did not broadcast panic to the dogs that would sniff the track at dawn. At the yard's edge, he knocked loose a slat on the hog pen. A few animals pushed into the open and waddled toward the light and shouting, their bodies making the sort of commotion that soaks up attention. He dragged a vinegar-soaked rag along a second path past the laundry so that any hound set to trail would keep losing its nose to acid. He passed the kennel and dropped a heel of bread into the corner to fix the most alert dog to its place for a crucial minute of chewing. He slipped through cane that lined the bank and found the skiff he had sunk under a sycamore root a week earlier. He tipped it free of water with steady hands, laid the oars without clack, and pushed into the current beneath branches that kept lamplight from reaching him. Behind him, the counting house threw a full throat of flame. Bell and Pike and Keen shouted orders that contradicted. What later jurors would call testimony showed only their own reflections in fire. Men ran for buckets that sloshed more than they saved. Someone finally remembered the dogs and loosed them from the pen, and a pair broke for the river path, baying at a confusion of vinegar and pig and ash. The pup, tired by the tangle, lay down and watched sparks drift like insects. The main house door opened, and Silas Calder stood framed by brightness, keys tapping his palm in a rhythm that meant nothing now. The irreversible moment arrived with no flourish. The ledger folded into itself like a blackened wing. The strongbox lid warped and settled askew. The clock's last tick died beneath the roar. Flame took the fig tree's lowest twigs and left the higher leaves blinking wetly in orange. On the water, Josiah set his oars into the slow stroke he had rehearsed in the dark, timing to the retreat of shouts and to the push of current. Across the bend, the northern bank held a low strip of lights, some in houses, one on a pole by the ferry. A lantern lifted and dipped twice, then twice again. An old ferryman's habit repurposed as a sign. Behind him, routine burned. Before him, the river widened into the only passage that mattered. He did not look back. The night, once a map, became a line crossed. At first light, the yard at Rook's Bend held the cold stillness after heat, the kind that settles in corners and rafters once a blaze has eaten and moved on. Smoke hung low over the counting house, a gray band that smelled of rendered tallow, lamp oil, oak, and rag. The first to see the inside clearly was Edgar Bell, sleeves blackened to the elbow, eyes rimmed red from soot and shock. He stepped over a charred threshold into a room whose objects had arranged themselves into testimony. The Dutch clock's pendulum sat frozen at a silent beat. The ledger table had lost one leg to fire and leaned like a broken knee. Its top burred and rippled, edges carbonized into scallops. Beneath it lay a petal of ash shaped like a leaf, delicate veins faintly pressed into the black. By the strongbox stand, a twist of melted brass curved like a fishhook fused to scale. The stand's wood had burned in a pattern that began low on the ledger side, not at the stove nor lamp shelf. Heat shadow along the wall suggested a draw toward the sill, a draft that had pulled fire inward rather than flung it out. Matthew Pike arrived next with 2 men and a barrel lid for a shovel, scanning instinctively for a culprit he could name. He circled once, twice, boot heels grinding the first usable prints into the clay floor, the half-moons of his own impatience. Ambrose Keene limped in behind, lamp held high though. Dawn had already found the room. He sniffed at the air like his young dog and frowned. His men prodded the strongbox lid with a stave and it gave, warped brass ringing a dull note as it settled askew. Inside lay coin sacks that felt wrong in the hand, too stiff for silver, too light for proper weight. One split under pressure, and spilled wrapped nails prepared to mimic heft. Bell did not curse again. His face collapsed inward a measure, and then stilled as a bookkeeper's mind arranged loss into columns. The spare key, which had not been where it should have been the night before, now appeared as that bent brass remnant fused to iron scale against the stand. The hollowed almanac on the low shelf had slipped forward from heat, showing the faint outline where a tin had once rested. The counting house told a story to anyone who could read it. Outside, the yard offered additional lines. The bell rope, tarred and frayed, swung lazily without a knot. In the smokehouse, a rusted padlock hung open with a bite mark of old corrosion that had finally given way. On the ground near the counting house sill, Keene found beads of translucent residue in the ash, the size of seeds and sticky when warmed between fingers. Animal fat thinned with lamp oil leaves such pearls when fire pauses and moves. A faint braid of cheesecloth, burned to lace, lay fused to the table leg and the sill's crack. Along the laundry wall, the clay showed a dragged smear with a sour smell that sent one hound sneezing and pawing at its own nose. Vinegar had been drawn across a path to foul the dog's first certainty. At the hog pen, a slat leaned at an angle, recently worked. In the kennel corner, a gnawed heel of bread lay wet and forgotten, a small gift that had bought a silent minute in the night. Down at the riverbank, near the sycamore with its root like a grasping hand, gouge marks in mud and scum drew a shallow V toward open water, the kind made by a skiff pried up and slid true. The morning organized itself into procedures. Pike pulled men into a bucket line to wet the hot edges that still hissed. Keene ran a hand across the sill and tasted the grease with a grimace he did not try to hide. He sent one man upriver along the bank and one down, each told to look for a beached boat or an abandoned oar. He kept the young dog leashed and circled toward the hedge, but the pup tangled quickly in the lingering confusion of vinegar and pig and ash and the heavy sweetness of molasses that clung to Pike's boots. Bell began to inventory what remained. The ledger, all but a few warped leaves, had gone. What survived showed neat corrections on the last day's figures and a speckled spray where sand had popped in heat. The survey map drawer held a torn edge but no river chart. Something had been palmed from beneath the book. He noted, as if for himself, the distance from the ledger table leg to the sill's crack, how fire had traced that short run like a wick. By mid-morning, the word reached Silas Calder, and by noon, the courthouse. The law's first act was euphemism. In a second-floor room whose windows looked toward the river, a coroner's inquest convened with the justice of the peace. 2 jurors drawn from merchants, and a clerk whose handwriting already leaned toward a summary. They called it misadventure in the initial line, a safe phrase that spared the planter class the embarrassment of naming their own vulnerability. Witness statements were taken while smoke still curled from timbers. Bell testified to balancing books before the supper, to returning copies to his room, to hearing the bell in the night and the later roar. He admitted to keeping a spare key in an almanac as if it were custom, not neglect. Pike described a false ring that had pulled him toward the smokehouse, men laughing, then the real ring, then flame. He did not credit the rope with a knot and did not mention his heavy boots. Keene spoke of residues consistent with care, of a tallow line drawing fire inward, of dogs confounded by acid. The clerk wrote deliberate conflagration in the margin and enclosed the phrase in a box. Money turned language harder. Counting after heat meant fingers blackened and patience scraped raw. When the strongbox yielded only nails where coin should lie, when stacks of banknotes were found halved and hollowed by cunning hands, a second gathering formed in the parlor of the main house, away from open record. There they chose another phrase. Losses sustained in the course of a fire. A construction broad enough to satisfy a river agent and vague enough to protect a reputation. The justice signed a version for the county file and kept another sheaf without signature. 3 statements would later be marked removed to special collection. An insurance agent from town visited, looked long at the strongbox and longer at the bent brass key, and advised replacing outbuildings in brick and moving ledgers to the main house at night. Every recommendation draped itself as prudence while refusing to speak the central fact. Someone they had counted as property had read their habits like a map and drawn his own line across a river. Search parties rode that afternoon and the next. Handbills appeared at taverns promising reward for information leading to the recovery of stolen funds and the apprehension of a certain Negro man, medium height, a smith by trade. The handbills named a sum in coin and instructed that any person aiding said fugitive would be prosecuted under federal law. Keene crossed to the northern town with 2 men and a polite request to the magistrate, carrying the latest printed notice of the fugitive statute as if it conferred inevitability. He found cool acknowledgment and little else. On the wharf, a ferryman with a lined face mended a rope with patience that outlasted questions. At the tavern, small bills changed hands for bread and a rough pair of boots, but the description fit too many men living free to give a single certainty. A skiff was found roped to willow roots 3 bends downriver, scoured clean of prints by rain that had come in the second night. Dogs showed interest, then confusion, then boredom. The river kept its counsel. Records stretched thin but did not disappear entirely. In a church book on the northern bank, a deacon later noted a donation in small paper toward a winter coal purchase, given by a man who signed as Joseph. In a town farther north, a blacksmith's ledger recorded purchase of bar stock and a second-hand bellows by a customer who paid in modest bills and asked no credit. Neither book gave a surname that matched. Both entries stood alone on their lines. quiet as if the hand that made them understood what excessive detail can cost. He had taken from Rook's Bend more than money. He had carried a set of skills that translated into survival, where law changed its terms. Back at the plantation, a new routine hardened into place. The counting house was rebuilt in brick with a cast-iron door and a second lock visible from the yard. Ledgers slept thereafter in the main house after dusk, under Silas Calder's hand. The bell rope was cut and reknotted to discourage private hitches. No one was allowed to touch it without Pike watching. Dogs were fed better and trained to ignore vinegar. A trainer from downriver taught them to track by broken fern and crushed grass when scent failed, adding distance and time to their hunt. The fig tree by the counting house wall, blamed as harboring both shade and mischief, was hacked to a stump that bled white sap and then blackened. Women in the laundry were made to work with the windows open no matter the cold, the better to smell any wrong kind of smoke. Patrol subscriptions rose, curfews tightened. Words like example and prevention circulated in the parlors and along the fence rails. None of it changed what had already changed. In the quarters, memory turned into code and caution. A half ring on a bell, if heard in later years in any yard along the river, meant check the rope and count the faces before reacting. Children were told a superstition in whispers. Fig leaves remember, so never step on one in a yard with a counting house. Elders turned parts of the story into fragments that traveled, about vinegar rubbed on a wall, about bread tossed to a quiet dog, about nailed weight that fools a heavy hand, about a skiff hidden under a root. The name Josiah was spoken softly and then less, until only the sequence remained and a purpose attached to it. There are nights when routine can be turned against itself if the wind is right and the bell is ready. The county file grew a spine and dust. The official verdict stayed misadventure with the loss of funds, confirmed by committee. The clerk who had written deliberate conflagration in the margin left the county for a job in a river office and carried a copy of his notes in his satchel. Years later, his grandson folded them into an envelope and donated them, along with the bent brass key and a page fragment, to a state archive that promised preservation. The envelope received a stamp that called the incident a farm accident. The soot pressed into the paper made its own argument, an argument that waited until a later morning when an archivist opened the seal and smelled lamp oil, faintly, impossibly still present. Across the river, where laws forbade the purchase of a man's future, a garden behind a narrow house grew a sapling that was not native to the place. It came from a cutting wrapped in damp cloth and carried like contraband. A piece snipped when a man passed a wall in smoke and heat and remembered sweetness. The sapling lived through a winter by being swaddled and buried against frost and leafed out the next spring into a literal memory that needed no speaking. In that yard, tools hung in order: tongs, hammer, rasp, because muscle memory is a kind of prayer when a name must be shed. Small bills paid for iron and bread until a trade could pay for itself. Neighbors there learned to recognize a half ring tapped gently on a ladle as an all clear, to be used only when the river had asked for silence and returned it. Years folded. On the Kentucky side, the rebuilt counting house endured without incident long enough for those who remembered the first to die or leave. On the northern side, a blacksmith who signed his purchases as Joseph moved again and then again, as if distance were a habit that kept breath in the body. No warrant crossed a desk with his new name on it. No patrol caught a scent that did not belong to someone else. The money taken that night did not crash into the river in a single purchase. It unfurled in small decisions: coal for winter heat, a second-hand bellows that still held air, a pair of boots that did not split at the sole on frozen mud. Revenge had been the engine. Survival was the work. A long time later, in Frankfurt, The archivist cataloging plantation incidents tapped the bent key against the table, testing its lingering music. The soot in the envelope left a fingertip black, and the faint outline of a leaf marked the new catalog card when that finger brushed it by mistake. A clerk down the hall retrieved a map and traced a dotted crossing between banks that matched a torn fragment found under the ledger's last page. On a photograph taken during a survey of the Rook's Bend site, a dark circle at the base of a brick wall showed where a tree had tried to live and had been cut. The archivist added a line to the file that previous keepers had not written: probable arson tied to theft, followed by escape across the river. The new phrase did not change the past. It rearranged where the weight sits in the telling. The ledger that once reduced lives to units of labor became, in its charred remains, evidence of an intention that outlasted the people who meant to control it. The bell, once a tool for assembling bodies at work, remained an image of a sound that could be bent into a stall, a pause to fit another plan into the space where obedience had lived. And the fig leaf, pressed by heat into ash, reappeared as a living leaf on the far bank, the same shape and a different meaning. The story that began with soot in a bent key ends with that leaf, green and ordinary, throwing shade over a yard where the only bookkeeping at dusk was counting breaths until sleep.